what is implied by listening in love? The possibility of listening in love. It implies that there's something in common, right? That we have something in common. So I wanted to look at empathy and sympathy and compassion. What we're going to look at is some passages in the Bible concerning empathy in particular. But before we start that, I'd be curious, how would you distinguish between empathy, sympathy, and compassion? What's the difference between those terms?
I think empathy is when you've gone through that yourself and you can relate to someone and you feel their pain, versus sympathy is when you just feel sorry for someone. And compassion, I think personally, is when you do something about that.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. So when you can put yourself in somebody's place, if you feel sorry for them, and then you can do something about it. That's nice, yeah. How about anybody else?
Especially if you have experienced the same type of issue, be it going through cancer, going through relatives having problems, sickness problems, or loss, then you can definitely identify personally.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you show empathy for a person if you have not had the same experience?
Ooh, we're gonna.
I think you can. I think empathy has more to do with actually being able to feel that other person's pain and that other person's discomfort rather than just having to have experienced it yourself. But sympathy is like the UPS driver that patted my 6-year-old on the head and said, "Oh, here's the poor little blind boy."
Ooh.
Not.
You see sympathy as a negative.
I see sympathy as a negative, and I see empathy as a positive. And compassion, like Elise said, I think that was a great definition of compassion.
Yeah, I think empathy, yeah. Chris, I think empathy totally is just putting yourself in someone else's shoes, experience or no experience, and just feeling what they feel. My personal opinion.
Thank you.
One of the things that I've learned from neurobiology is just that pain is a human existential response. And when we touch that, regardless of our experience, whether it's the same or not, we touch that human place with the other person that just speaks like you started right off, Sam. It's mutual, it's shared.
Making a connection with the person at a deeper level than an ordinary superficial conversation.
What is that deeper level, Chris?
Compassion.
Circle.
Yeah, maybe that deeper level has something to do with the Holy Spirit working through us.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I believe.
That's
Sometimes
fascinating. Wait, was somebody else? Did somebody else have something to say? I'm sorry.
I was going to say that sometimes you can attempt to empathize with someone, but you cannot feel what they were feeling because their situation is so, like if I say to a black person, I know how you feel. Well, that's not true. I don't know how they feel.
Yeah.
You know, you can be compassionate, but you really haven't experienced what they have experienced.
But you can care about how they feel.
Yes, you can compare about how they feel. You can say, you know, you have been wronged, or this doesn't work for you, but you know, you don't exactly, like if someone's suffering from cancer and you haven't gone through that, or an extreme illness, you can say, gosh, I don't know how you feel, but I understand that it's terrible.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you ever gone through something traumatic and other people say, I know how you feel, and you know they don't?
Yeah.
How does that make you feel when somebody says, I know how you feel?
Invalidated.
It depends, because sometimes people hijack the conversation. It's like, and let me tell you about this horrible thing that happened to me.
Yeah.
You know, you just want to, well, that's just not a pleasant conversation.
Agreed. But a good response may be, tell me how you feel. I care about your feelings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you
One of the
think-
most dangerous phrases I think that you can use is to say, I know exactly how you feel, which almost is never true.
Yeah.
That's right,
Hey,
yeah.
Susan, I think you're absolutely right. There's a natural pivot between I know how you feel and let me tell you how I feel.
Exactly.
What's behind that? I mean, what are we avoiding when we do that?
Pain.
Well, I think it's also not being willing to give that person some time. You know, I think a lot of times we want to focus on ourselves anyway. So it's really hard when somebody says something and, you know, you might have a great, like, yes, I had that experience, but it's not the time maybe to say that. I think the time is to hone in on somebody's telling me something that is important to them. And I want to try to honor that by trying to understand it a little bit more.
Listening.
I think listening, exactly, because I think sometimes we're uncomfortable with that space. We're uncomfortable with that little moment of silence, and we're feeling insecure in the moment. And so some of our tendency is to just fill the space, and then whatever thoughts come through our brain of similar circumstances are what we want to share. Not a good idea.
You know, another thing that, Stan, when you mentioned how does that make you feel, another part of that is that sometimes people will say, I can't imagine what you're feeling. I don't know how you are handling that. And that's pretty offensive, because everyone may go through, you know, hard times or difficult times, and so to say to one person, I can't imagine how you can handle that. You know, it puts down the person's fortitude and their ability to handle life's very difficult situations when they hand it to us. So that
I wouldn't have thought that, Willie. That surprises me.
oh yeah, I mean, when my son died, people said to me, I can't imagine how you are handling that. And that made me feel, you know, it was difficult for me to hear people say that to me. Because here I am, trying very hard to handle that. And then someone says to me, I can't imagine how you're doing that. I could not do that. And that's not true. I mean, if it happened to you, more than likely, you would handle it also. And so to put down another person's pain, another person's attempt at survival is harmful. No. It's very hurtful. I have that too as a Black person. People have said to me, I can't imagine how you survive as a Black person. I couldn't do it. I could never have been a slave, or I could never have lived through the 60s, or I could never have done that. And that puts down, that invalidates me to say to me that what you're doing is not a good and powerful effort. It says to me that, you know, I don't respect you, really, is what it says. I don't respect you or your struggles.
But perception is everything. And I would have thought that what they're saying is, you are powerful and you are strong, and I don't have that in me. But it's funny how we see things and hear things so differently.
Yeah, you think about that. If someone said to you something that you are handling very well, and they say, I don't see how you're doing that. I couldn't do it, you know, so it invalidates you.
I wouldn't have taken offense at that as a comment.
No.
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I see that as an acknowledgement of my own inability
where-
to do what you're
But
doing.
that's where we need to be careful about what we do and say, because
That's for sure.
we
Yeah.
can feel empathy, but if we say the wrong thing.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, it's very
my-
important to validate a person's feelings without saying to them that what you're doing, I could never do, or what you're doing, I could never imagine, you know. So you're putting yourself in a position to say that what's happening to you couldn't happen to me because I'm superior, or I'm
no.
better than you, or
Oh,
something,
It would
you know,
not-
something like that.
I can't,
So it couldn't
I don't
happen to
think that
me.
way.
It's happening to you, but it certainly won't happen to me, or couldn't happen
Yeah.
to me.
I would think of it as,
Don't invalidate Willie by telling her that you would feel that way.
yeah. I think of it the opposite. I think of it as saying, my goodness, you're strong, and I couldn't possibly have handled what you have had to, and I'm impressed at what you've had to do, and I wish I have the empathy, the sympathy, want to have the understanding of how you feel, and would be very difficult for me to have faced the same situation.
Yes, you know, I hear people saying things that I'm not sure you realize what you're saying. You know, like, don't say that to Willie. You know, it's not that I am, you know, so special that you can't say it to me. What I'm saying to you is that if you say to another individual that what's happening to you could never happen to me. I mean, that's the part that's not healing, because it could happen to you. It certainly could happen to you.
I think it comes from the fear that it might happen to the person that's saying it. I think they're scared to death.
Okay, here's a very good example of what we are developing here as a theme, which is listening. Listening with empathy. Listening is a hard skill, and it involves waiting and being patient and not jumping in and really hearing what the other person is saying. You don't have to respond right away. We'll learn more about empathy, but the listening part is the hard part. And that's where we have to do a lot of it right now in our lives. So,
you know, I was doing some reading, and one of the things that I read that's very powerful is when people are going through difficult times, the best thing you can do is to say, I'm sorry that is happening to you. You know, understanding that it could also happen to you. You know, giving people the impression that you're special and this would never happen to me is not sympathetic. It's not empathy. It's cashing in on some privilege or superiority that you think you feel. You know.
Can I say something real quick? I know we've all been, you know, as we get older, we've been through more and more things that are hard to deal with. I feel like my help has come from the Lord, and I don't, you know, any strength that I have has come through prayer, and I don't know how to express that to other people. I don't want to sound like I'm saying, well, I'm holier than thou, because I've prayed about this and I've survived it. But I have expressed to some people that leaning on Jesus is a very real thing for me. And I don't know how that fits into this conversation, but anyway, thought I'd enter.
well, it gives you perspective, absolutely.
Yeah, and I've had the experience of being very angry at certain people, and then I try to put myself in their shoes, and I kind of, you know, maybe God's perspective a little more, and I've kind of realized that, you know, I'm a very self-centered person. I am, you know, but I can, to some extent, put myself in their point of view.
So Stan, I was wondering if you saw examples in the Bible of empathy, listening with empathy. I can't think of one right now.
I don't see him.
I've lost Stan.
Oh no.
We need Stan.
Stan.
Are you there? Calling Stan.
Unmute yourself, Stan.
So I'm watching the waiting room. I'm a co-host, so if he appears, I'll admit him back in, but we appear to have lost him.
Maybe he had to take a break.
He's giving us a way to understand empathy.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is when we look at all the people in our lives, you know, there are a few people we can really count on to really empathize with us. And you know, but most people probably aren't giving us the type of responses we would love to have. So a lot of them are kind of inadequate, but that's just life. And I like what Jan was saying about leaning on God for that type of empathy.
And God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth because we're supposed to listen twice as much as we talk. But that's the fun part that I always told my kids. Hopefully they heard that. But as adults and as trained adults, we need to be active listeners. When we sense somebody is hurting, in our minds and our hearts, we can understand that, yes, we've been through that too. But it's, in my opinion, not the time for active sharing. It's the time for active listening.
Right.
They need to hear, they need to get it off their chest. They need to share that so that they can deal with it that day. I have known a lot of deep sorrow and a lot of deep joy. And so when people are talking about something that's really hurting them, all I want to do is listen. And sometimes that means dead silence for a while. And that's okay. Let them formulate their thoughts. Maybe a question or two, you know, I'm here, or, you know, how can I help, or something. But the biggest part is just the listening.
And the silence is golden. I mean, we've all heard that before. Silence is a place where we have to learn to be comfortable so that we're not filling the space with noise. Just being together with a person in silence is so powerful.
Speaking of silence, Stan is trying to get back into our meeting, but the internet died at the church, so he's going to try calling in with his phone. So we might have a little bit more silence from him until he can get connected again.
Yeah, I had to do that from here on the racial call that we had. You know, my internet died and I called in on the phone. That happens.
You know, I do want to say to the group that I understand and I appreciate, you know, I was saying before that it's difficult to hear certain responses. And that doesn't mean that you don't appreciate people reaching out to you and saying what they feel or whatever. It's just I'm saying that as a matter of how people are affected by that is that you don't want to take away a person's power, a person's feeling, invalidate their feelings by saying, you know, what I was expressing. So it doesn't mean that when you reach out to people that you will be, you know, rejected. Your reaching out is always appropriate. It's just we need to think about how we reach out, and we need to think about what we're saying and how we touch people. And so if people can share with you, tell you how that made them feel, that's valuable, because then you can respond and you can be empathetic in that way. That's the way I feel.
Welcome back, Stan.
Thank you. Sorry I disappeared. The Wi-Fi seems to be down here at the church, or at least I think the church network is down is what it is.
So we were thinking, Stan, about examples. Bible of people listening to one another. Examples.
I wanted to talk about two particular passages, or several passages, but the idea being judge not, lest ye be judged, and the golden rule. And we'll look at the implication that there's something in common in both of those passages, that as human beings, there are things we share. I did want to take a look specifically at the etymology of empathy, sympathy, and compassion. They all contain pathos, which is the Greek word for suffering, for something that befalls you, a tragedy. It's just that human condition. In Latin, it's passio, from which we get passion, as in the passion of the Christ. Empathy, the M indicates in pathos, in sharing. In other words, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, putting them in someone else's place. Sympathy and compassion are the same word, just different languages. The Greek version is sympathy, together shared pathos. The Latin is shared passio, shared passion. One way I think to understand sympathy and compassion in terms of that ultimate sharing is in the late 19th century, perhaps even early 20th century. In New York City, there was a horrible fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
Right.
And the owners had locked all the doors so that it was
Right.
women there. Locked all the doors so that the women wouldn't take a break or, disappear on the job so that they could control them. It was on the upper floors. So when the fire broke up, they were trapped. Out of this tragedy came several progressive legislation and work rules and work safety rules. But what was one of the things that was striking about this tragedy was we were faced with the possibility of burning up or jumping. And many of them decided to jump.
Right.
But all of them who jumped held somebody's hand so that they jumped together. That was that they were sharing that moment, that together. And the thought of doing it alone, being alone in that moment, was just too horrible. And so they held hands. They held hands. Same thing when the Twin Towers came down. When people jumped, they held hands, some of them. So there's something that we have in common, something deeply human, and that is a fear and a horror of being alone. But there's also that at the center is our vulnerability, our finitude, our passion, our suffering. We can see that in this proscription against judging. Start out with Matthew, judge not lest ye be judged. Luke's version is, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Again in Luke, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but fail to notice the beam in your own eye? And then in John's gospel, we have, when they continued to question him, he straightened up and said to them, let him who is without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. The implication here is that hurt, that suffering, that vulnerability, that finitude is related also to the fact that we have all fallen short of the glory of God, a realization of our own culpability, of our own shortcomings. We also know that the reality of sin is isolation. It isolates us. We looked in the sermon today from 1 John, perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment. Whereof what is the punishment? Is that we would be rejected, become abject, shunned, cut off, no longer fit to share this life to hold hands. We're condemned to be alone. We move to the epistles, especially to Paul's writing. There's also the assumption that we can't judge others because we've done exactly what we're judging the person for. We see this in projection. We see this in our president. You can almost always tell what he is doing because he says that's what somebody else is doing. I don't mean to, to rag on the president, but he's the perfect example of projection, right?
Yeah.
In Paul's letter to the Romans, he says, "You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on another, for on whatever grounds you judge the other, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." Look how that behavior works too. We cast out that thing, that suffering, and the finitude and the culpability. We want to get it out of us, and we project it onto somebody else. But what does that do? It isolates us. It makes us alone. It cuts us off from others. Again in Romans, "Therefore let us stop judging one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way." So not only do we condemn ourselves, but in that projecting, in that judging, we cause our brother or our sister to be isolated, to be alone. And maybe that's a little bit about what Willie was pointing to, with people say, "I can't imagine how you went through that." Perhaps that's a way of distancing ourselves from the pain, and then that just leaves somebody like Willie alone. Cut off, not quite human, outside the human circle of belonging. In 1 Corinthians, "Therefore judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of men's hearts. At that time, each will receive his praise from God." Interesting thing is here's don't judge, because not only is it not time, but as we will see in Matthew's parable, that sometimes that there's something we don't know that's going on. Maybe the thing that we're tempted to judge something for, we don't have the full story, but also that the things that set us apart are also often intertwined with the things that bring us together. So that if you root out all that is painful, then you can also rip out all that is good and unify. Listen to Matthew's gospel. "He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?' He answered, 'An enemy has done this.' The slave said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he replied, 'No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. And both go together until the harvest. And at harvest time, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, and gather the wheat into my barn.'" Time comes when we need to distinguish, to judge between what is healthy for us and what is unhealthy. But we shouldn't be too quick to do that, because in being so black and white, sometimes we can find ourselves isolated, again, cut off, sometimes even from ourselves. All right. So given all these, what is it that we all have in common? What is the basis for empathy? What would you all say?
Being human.
being human. And what specifically does it mean to be human in this context?
Love your neighbor.
And what allows you to love your neighbor as yourself?
Compassion, empathy, trying to.
God's love in us.
Yeah. Because there's an essential unity, right? There's something we share. There is a common humanity. And there's something, it's related to our finitude, our vulnerability. It's interesting in terms of passion, passio. There was a group of early Christians in the 2nd, 3rd century that fled into the desert in Egypt to worship God alone. This was the foundation of monasticism in Western culture. And eventually, the irony is these holy men went out into the desert and then to be away from people, and then people kept following them, so then they would have to keep moving further out, and they would gather people together. And eventually, they decided they couldn't fight this, so they started to order it and build houses for people to worship together, to be out there contemplating together, and that was the beginning of monasticism. But their ideal was something that they called apatheia, passion, or pathos. What they wanted to get, they wanted to be without passion, without pathos. Now, they weren't talking about stopping feeling, cutting off your feelings. They were talking about not being attached to those feelings, not being controlled by them. It's very much like a Buddhist understanding of letting go and not clinging. The ideal coming from the Stoics was that you would remain perfectly consistent in the midst of good times and bad times, being swayed by neither, that there was that foundation, that firm foundation at the start in which you would not be knocked off deep within you, in the soul. But there are limits to non-judgment, right?
Yeah.
For instance, how can a white person of privilege imagine what it is like to be a person of color? We brought that up. I cannot imagine what others go through.
Right.
Can you think of other limits to this thing that holds us together?
I think I'm essentially a selfish person. I just don't, I don't, there are limits to the extent that I can love another person as myself. Only prayer helps me do that, but I'm a selfish person. I just don't see any way to get around that.
So Jen, do you think are you uniquely selfish? Are you the only selfish person?
I think this is pretty much everybody. I don't think just me. No,
Yeah, that's also part of the human condition, right?
Yeah.
That's human. Yeah.
It's when there's a moral line and you think, I cannot go there. That's my moral line. And I'm saying no right now to what I'm hearing or what something that has happened, maybe at work, maybe in government, maybe at home, that you say, no, I'm not saying yes to that. That is my line. I do not have compassion for that bit. Okay.
Dan?
Yeah.
I offer one correction or amendment, that instead of saying that you can't imagine how someone else is experiencing the troubles of their life, I think you only can imagine. You cannot know. But imagination is the great source of reaching out and empathy. That's why we listen to music, why we come to church, why we hear the scriptures, why we read books. It is to cultivate a widened understanding, perspective, and willingness to look beyond ourselves. So I would think, you know, you can say, I can only imagine, but imagination is important, vital.
Bill, that is just spot on. I agree. The human capacity, empathy requires the human capacity for imagination, right? To be able to put ourselves in somebody else's place, in someone else's shoes. But what if someone's been so far removed from ours? And let's talk about race, because that's a great example. Our perspective, white folks tend to have a very different perspective. The world looks different from a position of privilege than it does from a position of marginalization, right? What allows us, if anything, to bridge that gap?
Communication with others who have experienced that is the only way we can bridge that gap, or to begin to have some sort of understanding. A former coworker of mine, when she has talked about her sons being pulled over just because they were Black, who were really of privilege because of where they live, but regardless of where they live or what they were driving, they were still Black, so they were pulled over for no reason at all. So to try and understand that is difficult, not having had that experience.
You know, Stan, we have seen a good example with the film we watched, 1964, when talking about folk going into homes and living and essentially walking in the shoes of people who were marginalized. And there are other examples like that where you can actually put yourself in positions of having the same having the same reaction to you, you know, putting yourself in a different situation. There are lots of examples. Many of us probably know the example of Jane Elliott, the sociologist who did the study with children of I think it's commonly called blue eyes, brown eyes, but she did a study that she put the children into positions that they could actually feel discrimination. And there are other examples like that.
So the point being is that our imagination can expand our empathy, right?
Well, not just our imagination. I mean, we can physically put ourselves into positions. I mean, people who have gone, for instance, the protests that are currently going on, and white people who have come into the movement and marched, and, you know, many have been beat and hit, some have been killed. That's a real way to empathize. And there are, as I say, there are other examples like that. I don't know if anybody's read or seen or read books by people who actually made themselves Black. You know, there's a book called Black Like Me. Yeah. There's a book called Soul Sister, and people made themselves Black and went into society to see what that was like.
Well, Willie, I would offer that marching and participating in other acts is really compassion. The act of will, the act of being willing to suffer along with compassion. It's exactly suffer with. So people who march, who risk jail, who risk being beaten going over the bridges, are people who are acting out compassion, which to me is an active concept. So whether you give blood or march or raise funds or whatever you do gives evidence that you are willing to risk and suffer with people who are themselves in suffrage.
So
I
Stan,
think we tend to dwell in terms of atonement. We tend to dwell on the idea that Jesus died for our sins as a payment, substitutionary atonement. That's only one way of looking at it. Another way is to understand that in the crucifixion, in the passion, Jesus was coming and sharing the burden of being human, even to the depths of the cruelty, to oppression, to depths of suffering, so that there would be nothing that would be free from God's healing, that God could transform even the darkest and the worst parts of us and turn it to good. So that really is empathy in action. Compassion is empathy in action, and Jesus is our model.
yeah, that's good. So Stan, what about the golden rule? You were going to mention that?
Yeah, don't have much time. So I want to problematize the golden rule. Can somebody tell us what the golden rule is?
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Or not
Right.
do unto others.
Yeah, or don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do.
Or he who has gold rules. The cynical one.
Doing to others as you would have them do unto you assumes a certain unity, that we're all the same, right?
Right. It also assumes that you have a good sense of self.
Good self, right? But does that mean that everybody has to conform? That everybody is exactly like me?
That never has worked.
Doesn't work, does it? Maybe a completion, a complement to the golden rule is what's known as the platinum rule. Do unto others as treat others the way they want to be treated. I think about that in terms of issues of pronouns, right? And gender fluidity, which is something that for many of us is just strange and hard to get our minds around. We are so conditioned to think in binary terms. You're either a man or a woman, male or female, period, and there's nothing in between. Well, biology and people's experience suggests that it's just not that clear cut. There are a lot of gradations in between. And the question is who gets to define us? So we have now hired, or in the process of hiring, our former AmeriCorps worker, who is a person who identifies as neither male nor female. So the issue is their pronouns that they prefer are they and them, etc. What that requires of us who are used to the binary way of thinking is, first of all, using language in ways that are not grammatically correct, and also something that makes us think all the time, and something that makes us worry that we're going to say the wrong thing and offend somebody, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's inconvenient for us, for people to emphasize their differences. How many times have you heard that I don't mind gay people, I just don't want their lifestyle rubbed in my face, right? It's the difference that is inconvenient for us. But what if we stepped further in the golden rule to the rules should be treating people the way they want to be treated, so that each one of us gets to define ourselves rather than being defined by the society. Any thought?
I'm thinking maybe love your neighbor as yourself is a little broader way of applying that.
Yeah.
So it seems
Thank
like it would allow, each of us to be genuinely and authentically who we are, and knowing that we are going to be accepted and respected, not judged for being that authentic person.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it also points toward the mystery of our faith, the Trinity, which is a claim about the nature of ultimate reality. What is really real, what is really true. And what our great mystery at the heart of our faith is that God is all one, and yet God is diverse. One in many, many in one. And because we have our being, we move and have our being in God, we participate in God's being. What that means is that all of us essentially are both one and many, diverse and yet unified. And seeing it that way, we no longer have to be trapped in the silliness of color blindness, for instance, right? Like the idea of the way we deal with race and difference is we refuse to admit it exists, which is ridiculous. It does exist. And it also implies that there's something wrong and shameful about the difference. Yes, we can see color. Color is beautiful. It's God's diversity. We all don't have to conform, but yet we all share that basic humanity. And it is based on our vulnerability, our capacity to suffer, our finitude. It's that we are all in need of mercy. So to translate that, how to deal with those who disagree with us vehemently, I would say that the key to the paradox to keep in mind is that the only thing that cannot be tolerated is intolerance, because it invalidates difference, right? The rules, if we are going to share our common humanity, the rule is that the common humanity has to be honored. And part of that commonness is that we're different. We're unique. We're beautiful. So if somebody is cutting down the very roots of our diversity, that must be rejected.
These things are not easy. Yeah. It's not easy. Not easy to look past the exterior to the core of a person, which is what we're called to do, and love that person for the way they are and how they are God's child.
Right. Right.
I've said on a regular basis at times, and I acknowledge my weakness, that I'm going to be judged because I judge too many, especially recently, more so the past 4 years. I've been judging too many.
You want to say more? What has changed in recent years?
What did you ask?
What has changed in recent years? I'm assuming that was Rich. Rich was saying in recent years he finds himself judging more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what he's asking you.
So many things.
He was asking Barb.
No, he's asking you.
Did you say Barb?
No, Rich.
No. Oh, you were asking me? Sounded like you said Barb.
I thought that too, and I wasn't sure where I was fitting in there.
Well, what's changed is
many things.
the divisiveness of language amongst us in the U.S. You know, we've disagreed in the past, but we haven't disagreed as violently as we have recently. When someone wants someone kicked out of a convention and encourages people to punch them on the way out,
Let's think about that.
that tends to lead to more discourse as opposed to just having someone escorted out. You encourage too many violent people. And we want to disagree at times, but not always have a brawl over it.
Right.
I don't know what we want to establish as an ending time on Zoom forums. It is noon. I just would like to say that it's been a terrific discussion. The word that I end up here with is healing. We have a big job ahead of us to heal our relationships with people that we have a different viewpoint with. And listening comes into that again. And so we'll be talking more and more about listening with love as in the next few weeks. Next week, I'll just go ahead and mention Gwen and Krista's going to be involved in it, right, Gwen? Talking about, I am talking about terrific experience that their campers have had this summer, even on remote, Zoom experience, and how that has really worked out well. And then we continue our theme of listening with love after that. Jeff O'Neill will be addressing it. And Stan, I have a question about Bible study. You say it's starting this week?
Yep, 10:30 on this one.
10:30? And how would, I would think that more people would be able to come, since it's on Zoom, they don't have to drive there?
They can request an invite from Tracy.
Okay.
So I'll send out an all church email to that
Okay.
effect.
And will you include the scripture that you'll be talking about?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah. There was one point I wanted to make before we close. Listening in love is not the same thing as being nice. I think as Christians, we often mistake politeness for love. Sometimes politeness and being nice can be an avoidance of love. There are times not everything can be acceptable. Not that and it's real easy for us to avoid to think that avoiding conflict again is love. Jesus was very divisive in his love. He knocked over the tables in the temple. There were things that were just not acceptable. He called the Pharisees a brood of vipers. What we are calling people to is common humanity. But if our common humanity is being denied, that must be denied and rejected. And that's what I had to say.
We appreciate. It's been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Stan, for giving us great examples and lots of things to think about.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan.